Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see you. I know you're just joining us, but we're at 2 o'clock, so we are going to get started. Delighted to welcome you here to our first Health and Social Care Network meeting, and delighted that we have Dr. Donald Macaskill here, who I will introduce shortly. We are on Zoom. We are recording so that we can share information later on. If you've got any concern about that, please do let us know. Make sure your camera's off if you'd rather not be in when we get to the discussion bit. I'm Sheena Arthur. I'm Partnership Manager at Glasgow Council for the Voluntary Sector with a focus on health and social care. So really delighted that we're here today with our first network event, and thanks to Lynn and Tracy for supporting us to be here and to get here. Please do feel free to participate as you are comfortable to do so. You should have a little reactions button at the bottom of your screen where you can put up your hand when we come to discussion, or just physically do that. We will keep an eye. Also, the chat function is there if you'd rather put something in the chat to comment or to discuss as we get to that point. And I really want to thank you all for your time being here. I know everyone is very busy, and I really want to acknowledge that we've been through a really difficult time. We're still in a really difficult time, and within our health and social care work, we're always trying to be hopeful and find the connections, and my role is very much about working with statutory colleagues, and it feels like that's getting tougher to be hopeful, to be optimistic, and I really don't want, if we're doing that and trying to find those connections, that in any way we're not acknowledging how difficult it is for people. But we really want to find the connection, and I don't think there's a more important time that we should be working together and finding our common issues. And we've got Dr. Donald Macaskill here, who is an absolute advocate for our sector with a wealth of knowledge and experience within health and social care, working for many years in this sector, and as the Chief Exec of Scottish Care, representing care providers and in the independent sector, and that includes charitable, not-for-profit, private and employee-owned organisations. And many of you will know that Donald is a strong advocate, passionate advocate for health and social care, and continues to challenge and advocate and for change in a very positive and constructive way. So Donald, when I was reading all the things that you're involved in, I'm just so amazed that we've got you here for this time. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And I'm going to hand over to you and not waste any of that precious time. Thanks everyone, and we will keep an eye on the chat, and it's over to you, Donald.
Thank you, Sheena. So this is the first task of the day, to see if these slides will share. Can somebody shout at me that they can see those?
Yes, I can.
Great.
That's them on. Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Sheena. And before we start, I just want to say I'm really touched and honoured to have been asked to come here at what is the launch event and the inaugural first meeting of the GCVS Health and Social Care Network. I've been aware of the work of GCVS, firstly as somebody who lived in Glasgow and ran a learning disability project for a long period of time, and it just goes from strength to strength. But to establish the network at such a critical time for the present, but also the future of social care and health in the city, is a really constructive measure. So I'm really pleased to be with you today. Now, in the advertising of this event, I promised and was asked to talk about what's on your screen there, why social care matters, why I think that we need to restore the human to social care delivery, why human rights are fundamental to social care, and how, building on the positivity of the Feely report, we can potentially keep that vision and that drive alive. Now, there's probably very little that I'm going to say to you today that you will not, as people and organisations committed to addressing the discrimination which people using social care services have experienced, there will probably be very little I say which will be original or new, because you are, the people in this room, the best advocates for the centrality of social care. But I want to start our conversation, and I hope it will be a conversation, by reflecting on the title, Always the Bridesmaid and Never the Bride. And first of all, I've got to thank or credit Lynn Williams, who used the remark in one of the many conversations that she and I were having about health and social care after one of the many fairly turgid meetings with Scottish Government politicians and officials that we have found ourselves in over the last couple of years, 3 years. And at the end of which we keep making the same remark, which is, do they understand social care? Do they really know what social care is about? Because it would appear from the context of what we've just discussed that they don't. So I decided to adopt Lynn's description, always the bridesmaid and never the bride. And then I began to do a little bit of exploration about, well, where did this phrase come from? And for your interest, it actually originates as a song in the 1920s, which might just include one or two people here, but it became famous as an expression from Listerine, the mouthwash specialists, who began to use it in 1924. I'll get over the boring history bit in a minute. But in 1924, they ran a campaign, often a bridesmaid, but never a bride, and they portrayed the luckless Edna or Eleanor, who despite all her efforts continued to be unlucky in love, and she didn't know why. All her friends knew why, and that was because she suffered from bad breath. But since it was such an embarrassing subject, nobody talked to her about it. So they ran this campaign, and it made a huge difference, because in 1921, Listerine made £100,000 from their sales, but the power of advertisement meant that 4 years later, they were up at $4 million. I should have said $100,000. So it just goes to show that you don't always understand the meaning of phrases which we have come to use in a very different way, because when we use it, we certainly don't think about mouthwash or the unluckiness of having halitosis. But the phrase means not being at the centre, not being as important, not being the star of the focus of that particular moment. And I suppose this afternoon I want to ask, is that a fair description of social care in Scotland? You bet you. But what do we mean by social care? Because for us to have a conversation, we need to understand what we're talking about. And I suspect there that we are getting to the heart of why we are struggling as a sector. And when I use the word sector, I mean those who work, those who deliver services, those who use services and supports, be they direct users or family, unpaid and informal carers, the social care community and collective. I think there is a sense in which we are not fully understood, perhaps especially by those who make opinion, make policy, and often make decision. One of the common misunderstandings of social care is that it is a series of services which are done to and for a person. It is described as a list of tasks and functions to enable somebody to be supported. In fact, in a lot of the most recent debate, not least in the National Care Service in Scotland, the word social has been dropped. It's disappeared. We're told that we're going to have these care boards. But this afternoon, I want to argue that care is not the same as social care, and social care is not just care, and that to lose that dimension of social care risks a loss which is quite fundamental and more than just semantics. Now, I'm quite sure if I did a straw poll of the people in this audience this afternoon, that most of you would say that social care is not primarily about services, about the tasks and functions which a worker or even a family member engages and involves themselves in. It is much broader. For me, social care is about connection and human relationship. It's about enabling somebody to feel they belong and to enable that person to fulfill their sense of identity and being. It's about independence, not a separation from others, but a fully coming together in relationship with others. And it is about community, citizenship, and all that that entails. For me, social care is profoundly about enabling an individual to become fully human in relationship with other, to achieve to their potential, and to use that old Scots word, to flourish until the last moments of their life and breath. It is as fundamental as that. Now, there are loads of definitions of social care out there, and this is the one that I tend to use a lot because it has a forward dynamic. It is not about doing to or for someone, but it is enabling, it is empowering, it is liberating that person to have voice, to discover identity, and to change and grow throughout life. It is not maintenance. It is not keeping people safe, well, healthy, and settled. It is radically different. It is about the messiness of living and loving, and it is allowing that mess, which is our life in relationship, to be creative and purposeful. That is why social care is so important, because it is social. It is about that connectedness. And as we all of us in any form of relationship know, it doesn't always go easily and smoothly. Relationships have their ups and their downs. So why do we presume that social care is always linear, stable, and progressive? Later on, I want to say to you why, for me personally, I believe that social care has to be a human rights issue, and that in itself it is a human right. And the stories on the front page of Scottish newspapers today, which shame people like me who worked on the same as you some 3 decades ago, show the extent to which we need real human rights and not the rhetoric of human rights to be at the centre of social care delivery in Scotland today. But one of the problems of the always a bridesmaid, never a bride scenario is that people, even if they should know better, do not fully appreciate and understand the massive contribution which social care makes, not just to the lives of those who work and those who receive supports and are influenced by them, but to the whole of the Scottish economy. The work of organisations, not least the Scottish Social Services Council, have over the last few years helped to highlight the economic benefit of social care to the Scottish economy. They have helped some of us realise that social care is not a drain and a deficit, a withdrawal from the Scottish economy and national purse, but has the potential of being a massive economic contributor and a driver for real social change and the creating of real citizenship in our community. And perhaps most recently, a report commissioned by Enable Scotland has independently shown that the gross value added dimension of social care in Scotland is over £5 billion. That even if you take out the 800 million which is contributed by side industries, that is still a massive 3.3 billion in gross value added benefit to our economy. As I'm often heard to remark, this is much more than agriculture and fisheries. It is much more than so many sectors which are continually held in highlight by our Scottish Government and by economists. And therefore, I am dismayed and ashamed that our national economic strategy, which was produced by the current government most recently, does not mention social care. The fourth economic benefit sector to Scottish society is ignored. It's not even there. And that not only diminishes the value of those who work and receive social care supports, but it diminishes the whole of the rest of society because it does not recognise the benefit which it receives and which it contributes to. And you might very well ask in the always a bridesmaid, never a bride scenario. Why is that the case? Because we know, we've published reports. We've tried to influence our closed-minded politicians of the economic value of social care in this country. They've managed it in Wales. Why cannot we do so in Scotland? And of course, I could ask that question until the cows come home and are milked the next morning, because all of you in this call know the answer to that question. Is it not the same reason why in ancient times in the Greco-Roman world that anybody other than perfection could not be portrayed in sculpture and art? Is it not the reason throughout human history that those who were born with difference, with disability, were marginalised, were deemed to be only fit to be out of sight and out of mind? Is it not the reason why even in these days we have perpetuated the cult of youthfulness and perfection and physical and intellectual and mental wholeness? It is the reason which those of us who work in older people's services have for years campaigned to have dementia recognised as primarily a health condition like cancer or diabetes or any of the equivalent, and yet still it is not recognised as such. And I could go on, because of course people with dementia, predominantly female, predominantly old, people use social care support, predominantly individuals on the margins, on the edge of perception and societal value and importance. The reason why social care as a whole is not valued is simply because of indentured discrimination and the victimisation of those who are othered by our political, social and cultural processes. And until we recognise, those of us in social care, that there is a fundamental bias against those who utilise the benefits of social care support services, then we will not move forward. Because the answer of discrimination and inequality requires us, first and foremost, to accept that reality. Now, to move on, both of those elements, a broad inclusive definition of social care and a sense that social care has a potential to be an economic driver, are at the heart of the Feely report. Now, I have to confess, and I've said this to Derek Feely, that I've had a little bit of a Damascus Road conversion, because when the independent review of adult social care was first announced and developed, I was one of the critics on the sidelines who said there is no way he's going to be able to engage and consult and involve people at a meaningful level in the short period of time that was allowed to Derek Feely and his team. But I am completely right in being wrong, in the sense that I have said to Derek, the report which was produced had an air of authenticity about it. It had a sense of accuracy. It felt as if I was reading the story of social care and those who use supports and those who constantly were fighting and are fighting an uphill battle against the system. And so the Feely report rang true, and it spoke to so many thousands. But the problem is that today, or at least for me personally, the Feely report feels like a dream which is slowly disappearing into the distance. Having been touched by the practical pragmatism of politics and economic reality, it feels as if that aspiration and hope of a very changed and reformed system seems to be shrinking. Feely rightly emphasised the contributive economic benefit of social care. He rightly addressed the implementation gap, which for me wasn't a gap, but a chasm between fantastic policy and legislation, which was innovative and giving to people their rights and dignity, and the patchy, if not broken, implementation of that policy in practice for all sorts of reasons. Now, this is not the place directly, but we may in conversation when what follows talk about the National Care Service. But oh, I groan between the gap between the vision of Feely and the reality of what we've been offered. I lament the absence of the energy and the drive which freely developed from the turgid pedestrian descriptions which I see in front of me in government documents. There is so much missing. There is a soul gap which we need to fill. But there is still time to shape and influence through consultation, through speaking to our elected members as they make decisions about matters which they have patchy and often misinformed views. There is time still to get the sense and the vision and the drive of Feely. And the reason why that is important is because the more I spend in social care of my life, the more convinced I am that this is far too important to be left to policymakers and politicians, however pragmatic they may be, because this is about life and livelihood. This is our world, and they need to take their hands off that which they do not understand, and many that which they do not care for, primarily because they have a myopia which is preventing them from seeing the world as it really is. Social care cannot be left to be the plaything of politician and commentator, the disinterested only thinking about a vote or the next media story. It is ours. It is too important because it affects our lives and our livelihoods. And that's why the social has to be reinvested into the National Care Service. I don't want a National Care Service. I want a National Social Care Service. And despite all the defence of senior government officials that this is social care, what I read and what I see is not social care. It is a mini version of the National Health Service. The title of this talk, Always the Bridesmaid and Never the Bride, suggests that it is time for social care to take centre stage, to stop being the bridesmaid to the NHS, to recognise that we are symbiotically linked with each other, but that social care has its own value, its own need, its own priority, not as the plaything of the NHS, not as something which will help delay discharge, but as a set of services, supports, as a philosophy, as a way of enabling our society to function, which is distinctive and special. So in conclusion, for me, that means that we have to use the potential of the prospect of a Scottish Human Rights Act. I have written, probably ad nauseam from the perspective of some people, a lot about how we have a real possibility of, as we as a nation incorporate the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, to be the first nation to explicitly say that the right to health includes the right to social care, the right to palliative care, the right to bereavement support, and to describe what that right means. We need to redefine the right to health as being more than the right to well-being, physiological or even psychological health. We need to see that social care is more than just emergency clinical health intervention, that social care stands alone as a human right to be preserved and protected and defended. So I think there is a real prospect in both the Human Rights Act and in the creation of a National Care Service to put the United Nations tests for a human right at the centre. And they are the principles of availability, accessibility, acceptability, quality, participation, and accountability. We have real potential. And if we do so, we can recognise that social care is my human right to flourish and thrive, to be independent, to have voice, choice and agency. It is not just attending to my health needs, it is so much more. But in the words of a pioneering human rights fighter, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. The future belongs to those who care and have compassion for social care, not to those for whom it's about a vote, a set of numbers, and a sales in a newspaper. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Donald. It was a a pleasure to listen. I'm just trying to absorb what you're saying, and I'm laughing a bit to myself that I was concerned about not being hopeful or energized because there was a lot there, a lot to absorb. Lynn is putting a lot in the chat information for people, but please do, if you have comments or thoughts that you want to share, then I hope you've got that from Donald, that is very welcome. We want to a participative discussion. Thank you so much, Donald, for your presentation to us in our first network event. So I've written a few little thoughts and questions, but I'm keeping an eye on the chat and hands if anyone, and Lynn, I'm sure will let us know, or Tracy, if anyone is wanting to come in with a comment. But it really struck me your point, Donald, about the perception, the discrimination, it's really striking, the contribution. And if it was even only about economics, why is that not being recognised? And it's come up in a lot of our events, in our World Reimagined and our social care conversations about this gap between the vision, which we've seen with lots of strategic bits of work. You mentioned the same as you, seeing that in the news today, it just made my heart sink. Decades of discussion, and where people are still experiencing some of the same, I guess it is discrimination, not having the right to freedom and access to a purposeful life. So do you have thoughts on how do we, is that Human Rights Act, do you see that as a key way that we can really get that in the centre of the work? Because it came up, we had our colleague from Sea Change talking about that. We have the legislation in place. We're not using it, or we're not, as part of our thoughts about the health and social care network, maybe we're not mobilising ourselves collectively to have a strong enough voice.
There's a lot in that, Sheena. I think first of all we've got to recognise that if you're drowning, then your first priority is to grab onto something or to make sure that you can swim to the shore. And for a lot of people who use social care supports, and a lot of people who work in social care, they're drowning. They have very little capacity or time or space to imagine better and to do differently. And the whole system doesn't help to give them that space and reflection that, in which they can do that. So I don't think we should be critical of ourselves who have been asking questions, raising concerns, shouting from wherever we happen to be, because we can only do a certain amount. But we can be critical of those who ought to know better and who know better. And so I'm critical of the lazy journalism and the even lazier political leadership of all parties who go for the simple answer. And one of the simple answers is that you introduce progressive dynamic legislation and then you walk off the pitch and you think that's the job done. Because Scotland has the most fantastic legislation, whether it's the Carers Act, the SDS Act, the Mental Health Care and Treatment legislation, and I have absolute confidence that whoever develops the Human Rights Act in Scotland will get us a humdinger of a piece of legislation. But as those of us who've survived the pandemic in different ways, and I think especially of people working in my sector and what happened in terms of the prioritisation of older people in care homes and families and visitors, as we know well, simply having human rights legislation on its own doesn't make an iota or a jot of difference. It is the empowering of people to be human rights advocates and fighters that makes the difference. Now, I'm old enough to have remembered delivering courses in person-centred planning as we closed Lennox Castle Hospital in Glasgow. And somebody in one of the groups that I was facilitating said, the difference to life is made not by this paper stuff, but every time somebody's relationship changes. And that's the problem with social care. We shout, but we actually don't help people to change their understanding of the sector and the importance and the priority of the sector. And as somebody who did a lot of training in discrimination, you only change people when it becomes their story and they recognise themselves in the story. And that's where we have failed thus far.
Thank you. One of the things that really struck me as well was you talking about the messiness, you know, of life and love and relationships, and yet we expect, you know, our sector or the support people receive to be linear, to be stable, when most of our lives are not that way. And yet when we support someone or look at somebody's needs, we somehow expect it to be almost like the perfect scenario, and that sets everyone up to fail. And I know I've been having quite a lot of conversations with colleagues, statutory colleagues, about risk, and I think that's part of that, the risk of, and I know certainly when I worked with AGK in Cornwall, we had lots of discussion about risk, as if when you get to a certain age, you should no longer swim in the sea or walk near a, you know, on unstable ground or whatever it is. But that's about people's right. It's them that hold the risk, in my view. But there's a big cultural shift needed if we do that. And if that's one example, I think there's many others that are about, we need to have people right in the centre of shaping, like you say, the actual implementation of things. And that's what we're really keen to get people, because they'll probably come up with much simpler solutions than a room full of only professional people.
I think you're right, Sheena, and risk is at the heart of it. But if you think of any human relationships, you are allowed, enabled to take risk,
Yeah.
and to do something which you might not be confident about because of the trust that you have built in that relationship. And the system doesn't bestow trust. So we treat adults with a learning disability as if they are not adults. And you know, having run a learning disability organisation many years ago, the boundary, the suffocating of risk assessment rather than enabling people to live their life, because there's no such thing as safety. It's an illusion, which probably our parents convinced us of at the age of 6, but we should have grown out of it. It's possible, but we're not there, and that's why Feely and everything he said about ethical commissioning, about removing competition in terms of contracting, about bestowing trust to those who work and those who provide services and those who receive services to be really in control, that was all about trust. And the last 3 years, trust has evaporated like snow on a June dike. And if we're going to take risk and build a national care service worthy of its name, then we're going to have to start trusting, allowing people to take risks. And part of that means allowing them to fall flat on their faces, get themselves up and find a new direction.
Thanks very much, Donald. We've got people patiently waiting now with questions. I'm going to come to Amanda first, and then John Paul, I can see your hand raised. Thank you for waiting there. So Amanda has asked, how do we change the narrative that affects real change? I don't know if you want to come in, Amanda, or if you're happy with your question being read out. Please feel free if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. Yes, I am the parent, or shall I say only the parent, because that's what I'm normally known as, you know, of someone with a learning disability who I fight daily for, in order that she has the right to live her life the way everybody else lives their life. And I've, you know, I attend things I was part of the Feely review. I attended lots of things when all those, when the consultations were going on there. And we talk about the same things over and over again. Everybody wants a human rights bill in Scotland. We have fantastic legislation in place for self-directed support. As Donald says, the implementation is patchy at best. So how do we not keep having the same conversations, banging our heads against the same brick walls? And what do we need to do to change the way other people think?
Do you know, if I had an answer to that, Amanda, I would feel that I at times hadn't wasted the last 3 decades, because I was having these conversations as part of, projects 30 years ago, and there is still the same. And today's newspaper highlighted that the only thing that convinces me that change happens is when one person holds a conversation with somebody who was lacking in knowledge and changes their mind. So change happens by individual conversation becoming a collective, communal conversation. And it means that those of us who are tired have to find those with energy in order for our voice to become louder. And that's the slow, incremental change. But, I'm privileged to know many activists over the years for different causes. And every single one of them in different ways will say the thing that brought real change for them, wherever it was an individual conversation. And at the moment, because we're tired, and I mean the collective we in social care, we're not holding those conversations because we think they have gone and fallen into silence. But if we shut up and we go silent, then we won't make the change. Now, that all might sound extremely prosaic, but it is something I do think is the only way forward, is to convince by conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Can I invite John Paul in, who's got his hand up? Welcome, John Paul. Nice to see you.
Thanks. I'm John Paul Moffat. I'm the National Director of Bridesmaid Scotland, and we've got 6 branches throughout the country. We've been going on just over 14 years, but there's just recently we've had new branches pop up. But I'm National Director of Bridesmaids. There's three other Bridesmaids director colleagues of mine. We've all came into the job having a learning disability. So we've got a background to where we came from. But with regards to the Bridesmaids kind of members, they come join to build friendships, to build relationships with other people with a learning disability. What we tend to do is do a human rights approach to, like, when they join Bridesmaids. For example, most times throughout the year we do training courses. So the members have got like the chance, if they're going out, if a relationship falls down, then we've got someone else to so they've got to talk about it, or like what to say. One of the courses we do is what to say after a hello. If you're at an event and you're sitting yourself, these are good options. Also, friendly faces, kind of training. They're all kind of like, and all the Bridesmaids events that we do them in a possibly a location in the city centre where it's members of the public are seeing what we do. But one thing that came to mind when it was years ago, back in 2017, myself and my 2 colleagues at the time went across to Prague for a love, life and friendship conference, and it was a great opportunity to go. But what we found was a lot of organisations from, I'll say, Eastern Europe, they've not moved on with times. But with Bridesmaids, and I was telling them what we do. But what we've did over, as I says, over the almost 15 years we've been going, next year, we've given people the opportunity to reconnect, like as you says earlier on, Donald, about the Let's Castle stories. We've got some Datesmates members who come out of Let's Castle, out of the the residential places. A few Datesmates, they might have drifted 30, 40 years apart, but a few Datesmates, they come back into that circle. And also just recently we had the Ladies Bridge project up in Aberdeen, and some Datesmates and also Sea Change Aberdeen folk, and Datesmates Aberdeen folk, they reconnected through that as well. But it's just a human, just trying to get, I've say the older generation, like pets and carers, to like move on with the times, because some pets and carers might say they've got like the kind of mollycoddle folk still from what I did years ago to up to date. So that's like a wee bit from where we came from, but also some barriers along the way. Just all this hand.
Thank you, John Paul. So some good examples of a change in that attitude about risk, maybe, and about what we should expect for our friends and loved ones, and maybe about how we work, for those of us that work with people as well. Would that be right? Yeah, great, thank you, and thanks for sharing the good work that you've got going on. You've reminded me of my experience supporting a family member who told me she had a boyfriend, and the first thing is I'm worrying about, you know, how that's going to progress and contraception, and she's like, we're going for a cappuccino. You know, and I'm like, you know, so there's, I can talk the talk, but I can feel different emotions when it's someone you care about. It's not always easy, so it's great we've got people like you helping us with those attitudes. Thank you. We've got Shona has a question about the influence. You mentioned journalism and the media, Donald, so I suspect it's come from this. How do we influence positive media relations? I don't know, Shona, if you would like to come in or just want me to read out your question.
Well, it was just really about that sort of positive media relations. I work in care at home and enablement services, both commissioned and through the partnership. And I just think it's like what you're saying as well earlier on, Donald, it's like people are drowning right now. There's really little time or capacity to be able to make changes, and everybody wants to be person-centered, and everyone wants to move away from time and task and be more flexible. But we just can't get staff at all. And then when we do get staff, we're losing staff. So there's that kind of high turnover. We've just had some major investment in a team where the salaries have been increased quite dramatically. And initially we got a good amount of people applying, but then they dropped out because it was still the personal care side of things that was putting people off. And it's about how can we change that? Because I think everything we see in the media around social care is so negative around working in the community and working in care at home. And when you speak to people who are delivering it, a lot of them are not negative. They're hugely positive. And we've got care ambassadors now, and we're trying to get that message out there. But how do we get, and somebody else said about that collective voice, how do we collectively put positive stories out in the media that actually are in, you know, dramas and programs in the news that actually represent us positively?
I think that's absolutely the nub of the issue, Shona. And you know, my own organisation's at the moment commissioned, and they're being filmed next week, films about home care and about care homes and about services, and lots of other organisations will be doing the same. And it is through, and you know, and I do a lot of work with arts organisations and to try to influence the change to the cultural narrative that social care is not just what the common perception of it is. It is what John said. You know, I remember in my old days struggling, trying to convince, as Sheena, you know, jumped from a cappuccino to contraception, the fear of parents around their member of their family with a learning disability dating somebody in the day centre. And that fear was only overcome by experience and knowledge and awareness. And the problem is we've got a media feeding negative images, stereotypes, and in some instances falsehoods to a general public who are unable to see the wheat from the chaff. So it is continually telling the story. I think working in social care is one of the most rewarding roles imaginable, because there is few other opportunities where you have the privilege of being and becoming so close to an individual, whether that's a long term or even a short term at their end of their life, to see change, to be present at times of real loss, grief, vulnerability, and to be present at times of celebration, enjoyment, and life change. It is so broad and it's so fulfilling. And you're right, Shona, I've heard organisations who have increased salaries and have given extremely beneficial terms and conditions, and they're still struggling to recruit people and compete with retail or with hospitality. And that's where collectively we need to start celebrating social care, not as a set of services or things that you do, but as that life rewarding, fulfilling, changing experience. And for most people, and I go to schools and talk about social care, for most people, yes, the money's important, of course it is. And once they get beyond the fact that they're not going to be a multimillionaire after they've left school, it's about fulfillment, reward, and satisfaction. That's what we need to build on, and that's what we've got lots of evidence from Dates and Mates and loads of other examples in Glasgow and elsewhere about the way in which social care gives life and changes life.
Yeah, thank you. I love that message. I think that's something to talk about for our network. Lynn, I'm scribbling down about that role of sharing the stories and the impact and the privilege that Donald's mentioned there. Thank you. I'm just trying to multitask, not doing it very well at the moment. Ron, lovely to know that you're in our group today. Has put a comment in, loved your analysis about the soul gap that's missing from current reforms. Would you like to come in, Ron?
Hi, Donald, how are you?
Hi, nice to
Very good. Yeah, I mean, Donald knows this anyway, but he and I share a lot of views around about the reforms that that we're about to see taken forward, and I share his concern, not just about the soul gap, actually a lovely little phrase, but wider worries that we have around about how the National Care Service might be formed on the basis of an NHS template, for example, with a very strong command and control mentality that begins in St Andrew's House. And I think, and this was implicit in what Donald was saying, I guess, that some of that goes back to the fact that social care is understood as a series of transactions, and incorrectly understood as a series of transactions. And some of that has its roots in the NHS, some of that's, I think, got its roots in things like free personal care, which has attempted to define, social work, social care in that transactional way. And I think a lot of this is back to front, truthfully, and we need to be much more empowering in the approach that we take, and much more involving. So to give you a case in point, and this is perhaps an illustration of the soul gap that Donald refers to. When Derek Feely wrote his report, he imagined a fairly inclusive approach to the governance of a national care service, which would involve lots of different people who use services, people who are involved in the delivery of services, trade unions, and so on and so forth, all sitting together around a table nationally, overseeing the delivery of arrangements as part of the National Care Service. But we've heard nothing about that under current proposals. All we have to work on is the idea that this will all be accountable to ministers, and that ministers will decide I mean, I just don't think that that's an especially inclusive way of developing a new national service. And truthfully, I don't think the NHS system of governance is the model that we should be pursuing here. So that's a personal view, but a lot of what Donald said earlier resonates with me for sure.
Thanks, Ron. And one of the things in Derek Feely's report, which hasn't really been picked on, and when it was written, I thought, yes, is the idea of a social care covenant. And covenants, I remember writing at the time, it's a really rich concept, especially in Scotland. Now, if you remove the quasi-religious politics from this, the idea of gathering around something which you mould and you shape and you hold allegiance and commonality in purpose with is what social care should be about. And maybe that's what groups like GCVS and others, maybe that's what we need to do, is pick up Derek Feely's challenge to create a social care covenant, which isn't a piece of paper, but it's a movement in which we are saying, this is social care and this is why it's important. You know, we've heard about from John about dates and mates, and I mentioned the closure of Lennox Castle. I have been privileged to listen to some of the real pioneers of the learning disability civil rights movement in the United States. You know, people like John O'Brien and Marsha, you know, the Pierpoints and those who developed learning disability models. And all of them, bar none, used the phrase in a different way, that change happened, yes, by a conversation, but by a movement of those who hold and held those conversations. And that's why I said in when I was talking that this is too important to be left to the politicians and policymakers, because it's not their life or their livelihood. And if we're to create a movement, a covenant around which people can gather, that I think would go some of the way to protecting the vision of Feely and maybe put some soul back into the National Care Service.
Thank you, Donald. Lynn, does that answer, or you've put in a wee question in the chat? Would you like to come in?
Yeah, so thanks, Donald. I think I'm aware of the social covenant group that was set up by the Scottish Government probably just after the Feely review came out, and there's some cracking people on that group. I mean, you'll know many of them as well, but I get the sense, and this could just be me being my cynical self, but I get the sense that it's probably a sideline rather than the main show, which it should be. So it's kind of like, well, here's people who need social care, we'll just put them in a side room. Well, the big discussions and debates about money and how the services themselves has been done behind closed doors. And that's the sense I get very much. It's something that is not really engaging with people right now and not really trying hard enough to do that.
Well, I comment on that, Lynn. Do you want me to comment on that? So I'm not on the social care covenant group. I'm not saying that was a deliberate decision, but I have colleagues who are, and I know a lot of the people, as you do, Lynn, who are on it. I don't think you can create, I don't think government can chair or nurture a social care covenant. It's not a group, it's not a committee. It's something which has to have an energy of its own. It has to be embryonic. It has to be, in a sense, organic of those who have been engaged and involved in the sector. So I think it's maybe up for the sector, including many of the voices in this call, to say, right, let's create our own covenant group, not in opposition nor in competition with the government. But I don't think you create a movement from St Andrew's House. In fact, the only movement you create is one out the front door. I think that has to come from somewhere else. And one of the gaps that I'm sad about is that after the positivity that we gave to Feely, and it wasn't perfect, there was stuff that, you know, you and I, Lynn, would have liked to have seen done differently and better expressed, but at least it was better than some of the stuff that we've seen. And I think it falls back to us in the sector, tired though we are, to create that movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my worry, Donald, is that, and I think you and Ron have raised those worries, that certainly I think we'll probably explore that in our response to the bill rather than responding to the legislation itself, because I think it's very detailed, and I think we're going down the route of the public bodies bill that you'll remember many of us suffering through, is that it focuses on process and structures rather than what we're looking for. And I think my fear remains, and the feedback we've had from various events, is it just takes social care further away from people in terms of accountability and transparency, and I don't get the sense that we are co-creating this vision. I don't think we are. I think my worry is, I don't know if we've maybe missed that boat. I hope not. But certainly, I think from all we've heard from our members and those that work with us through various events, is that it doesn't go far enough. And I think, I think there's just something there that I think maybe the sector has to maybe come together and say, you know what, this is what we think social care is about, and this is what we want to see. And that comes down to capacity. It comes down to money and funding for many organisations just now, as you're aware, the cost of living stuff, which I'm sure we'll cover. But yeah, I still have hope. I think, the fact that social care's up there and being discussed at that level for the first time properly is a good move, but it's what happens after that, I think.
Yeah, and sorry, Sheena, I'm jumping in there. And I think what's happening now relates to what the future will be, because as more and more care organisations are at a point of crisis, as more informal family carers are going to be really challenged over the autumn winter, there's a danger that we focus on the fact that we're saving ourselves from not drowning rather than on the change that's happening around us. And my worry is that it'll be too little too late.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, for a lot of my members, they don't care about the National Care Service.
Mm-hmm.
They care about being able to get enough workers to do the shift tonight, and getting enough income in order to pay the electricity bill, which is 6 times more than it was 2 months ago. So
absolutely,
for some of them, it feels as if the National Care Service is a bit like, painting the deck chairs on the Titanic and ignoring the iceberg.
Yeah, I think that's my last comment was going to be exactly that. I think that it's become the main show, but the main show's over here. So all the stuff that you're seeing, and I know, Amanda, I'm also an unpaid carer as well. So the fact that we're about to get into another winter of COVID, and most families are pretty much on their knees, and social care is definitely on its knees this time, is what concerns me. So I guess it's how we take events like this and speak up more openly as an organisation, which we are doing. We are being quite openly critical of where we are as an organisation, saying that social care is not working. But how we collectively do that as a sector, independent third sector, however, it's how we take that and maybe start to sort of speak out and say, well, actually, no, this is not good enough, and be more vocal, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Lots to think about for what our network's about, Lynn. Amanda has put her hand up, maybe in response to what you were saying, so I'm going to invite her in.
Yeah, actually it was. It was just to come back on something that Lynn said about, being tired, and, the crisis for a lot of people, who are coping with things that are going on in social care at the moment. And as Donald just said, it's about, who's going to cover a shift at night. People, I think my fear is that people who have been wanting to change the lives of the people that they support and that they love are being told that this can't happen because there is nobody to come to work. They cannot get the staff. I can't get staff to come on board to help me enable my daughter to live a good life. And so therefore she becomes less important. And so, so things people just become expected to fulfill roles and become support workers. I'm my daughter's mum. I'm not a support worker. I want her to have a life that doesn't involve having her old mother around her 24/7. And because I don't think it's right for her to have that life. I think she's entitled to have a life like any other 23-year-old and be out doing things. But that requires her to be supported. And so that requires her to have a good quality member of staff who has a decent salary, who is valued as a person themselves, the role they do. It's always seen as such an unskilled job. We need to change the way that people are perceived and the way that social care itself is perceived. And it's time for us to get a seat at the table. You know, we don't have one. We need a seat at the table.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for putting that so succinctly. Donald, did you want to come in there? You're looking like you might.
No, I'm I completely and utterly agree with everything that's just been said. I think it even goes further than that, Amanda, that it is perceived that we do have a seat at the table, that and there are people on this call who know that at government committees there'll be family carers, there'll be people like me from the independent, and people like Ron from the charitable sector. So, but nobody's listening when we're at the table, because they have one focus in mind. And that I said earlier, it's the myopia around the NHS. We have politicians of all colours who can only see the world when they're wearing NHS glasses. Now, the NHS is fundamentally important to the well-being of society, but if social care collapses, and it is probably closer to collapse in parts of Scotland than I have ever experienced, including during the really dark days of the pandemic. It's probably closer now. Then the NHS in those areas will collapse within a month. But they don't see that because they've tunnel visioned, myopic. They only see what's the impact on the NHS, what's the impact on delayed discharge, what's the impact on recruitment of nurses or care staff and healthcare assistants. So when we finally get politicians who can see the whole system instead of one part of the system, then we'll get services and supports which put people at the centre and not one particular branch. And we're a good distance from there, despite the fact that many of us are at that table.
Thanks, Donald. Shona has her hand up, so I'm going to invite Shona in, and then I would like to suggest just a quick comfort break before we go into reflections and thoughts about the National Care Service. We're starting to do that, but just to give people a short break before we do that. Shona.
Yeah, I was just wanting to mention something that we're trying in our local area about trying to do something really different. I know lots of people are using different approaches, but just when the lady was asking that the previous question a minute ago about, you know, extra responsibilities or making it more an attractive role. So we're trying to do that in this area. We've significantly increased the salaries, and amazingly, we've had like 20 applications, which is unheard of for our area. So it's starting with a really positive approach, but it's based on the wellbeing teams model. So as a direct, you'll be delivering direct care, but you'll also have other roles and responsibilities within there. And we've got a really, really great training program being developed. So they would be like, have the skills of a social work assistant, occupational therapy assistant, social prescriber, all rolled into kind of one sort of super carer. So it makes the role hopefully more attractive for people that are delivering it, and really very much based on our locality model. But we've significantly increased the salaries in and around that as well. So I suppose there's a bit of nervousness in their partnership as well. I mean, obviously we're all hoping that it's going to be a great success, but if it is, then we'll be looking at other people to be providing that level of service in the area, and it requires a lot of investment. But I think we do have to do something radically different in the way that we're delivering care, so we can get people into the sector and that we can keep them there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Shona. And that, if that stability is maintained, then that will save money in the long term, won't it? Because it, as well as the impact on people, there's an economic impact of having a constant recruitment process. You've got a thumbs up from John Paul there, Shona. Thank you, everyone. Shall we take a quick break and then come back for a bit more reflection? Does that, I can't see many people, but we'll do that and just come back at 3:10. Is that okay? Yep, great. Got some thumbs up. So see you at 3:10, and thank you all so much for your contributions so far. See you shortly.